So here we go. We have Claire here, and she's the director of the Academy of Ideas. Academy of Ideas run a thing called Debating Matters, which happens in schools all over the country, where students get together and discuss issues and debate robustly. And if you know any schools that are interested in getting involved in that competition, people who win the debates go on to the next round. And every year as well, the Academy of Ideas run this amazing event called the Battle of Ideas, which is held in London in October at the Barbican. And that's another amazing event which is all online. It takes over the whole of the Barbican, and it's kind of run like a music festival where you can go into different debates. You know, like you just have to think, what band am I going to go and see? You go in and listen to specific debates with all sorts of different opinions expressed, and the audience can get very involved in the discussion. So it's like a weekend of thinking and talking and debating, which is wonderful. So, Claire is here. She's, I don't know how many of you are here just to see Claire or just for the idea of the subject matter, but those of you who don't know, she's a panellist on BBC Radio 4's The Moral Maze, and she's regularly invited to comment on developments in culture, education, media, and particularly free speech issues on TV and radio programmes in the UK, such as Newsnight and Any Questions. Often when you hear Claire, she's quite vociferous in her opinions. But here we're going to be looking at the ideas behind her opinions.
Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking to Claire Fox about the ideas expressed in this book. I find that offensive. For those of you who haven't read this book, it's amazing. I say that because I read it in 2 days at 2 different occasions while I was having a cappuccino at Starbucks. So it's very, very, very readable. I expected to, spend at least a week reading it, and I finished it in 2 lunches because it was that page-turny. And one of the issues that this book is about, maybe the main issue, is it challenges a kind of narrative that we have about activism, and political activism from the left specifically. Now, what this narrative says is that things were really bad in the past, in the 1950s and before, and they got much better, much more culturally open and egalitarian in the 60s and afterwards, because students on campus protested. They expressed anger. They platformed people. They stood in picket lines. They shouted and they screamed. And eventually authority figures had to take notice of what they were screaming about. And changes happened politically. Changes that at the time the majority might not have even agreed with. But the changes happened because a minority of activists stood up against power, and in standing up and in expressing anger, they forced the rest of society to basically capitulate to their demands, and that's why we live in such a nice society today. And what Claire's book does is it, in a roundabout way, challenges that narrative by suggesting in a number of ways that this tradition of activism might be one in which actually the majority is bullied into complying with the demands of a minority of angry people who don't try and persuade the majority, but instead try and censor them, either officially or unofficially. And that's what's exciting and interesting about Claire's book. And on that note, I'm going to have her come to the stage and we're going to talk about it. So here you go, Claire. So first thing I wanted to ask you is, you obviously have an activism background yourself. You grew up at Coventry University, right? And you got involved in politics when you were a student. Is there something quite different about the activism that you partook in as a young person to the activism that you see today and that you've written about in your book?
I think there is, but that could be quite self-flattering. I don't know that I could say, oh, I was a model activist and now all the youth of today are all hopeless, without sounding like a middle-class woman moaning about the youth of today. But I am concerned that the biggest change, I think, for me, is that many of today's activists, it does seem to me, their activism is driven by seeing themselves as victims, and the enterprise of activism has lost its intellectual soul, in as much as it's not so much based on having read a lot and thought about a lot of issues, but often based on how people feel and so on and so forth. So what motivated my activism, I mean, I was, I don't know, but anyway, what motivated me was I remember going to a meeting where people will have had this happen to them, will maybe recognise it, but I went to a meeting when I was 18, 19, obviously thought I knew it all, and made a very articulate and passionate intervention from the floor, and the speaker said, "You're talking rubbish," and I thought, "Oh, I can't believe it," and there was a row, and then afterwards came up and said, "The problem with what you said is it's ill-informed, you've just got one view," and so on and so forth. And I sulked, like all 18, 19-year-olds would, but what I did do, what it motivated me to do, was to go and read around the subject, and then I discovered I didn't know anything about it. And I think that in today's circumstances, what would be more likely to happen would be that I'd try and no-platform the speaker and say that I found what they said offensive and wouldn't go off and read the book, if that makes any sense. So I think that maybe is a contrast to... So it's not that I think I was a brilliant activist, I just mean that as young people, we were as idealistic and right or wrong as any young people today, but we held each other to account in a very different way.
Okay, so one of the interesting comments that you made is you worry about the victimization narratives of today's activists. What I wanted to ask you is, how is it possible to do activism where you don't portray yourself as a victim? Because it seems like whenever you do any activism about anything, you're complaining about an injustice, and presumably if there is an injustice, somebody's a victim. So how do you get victim out of the activism equation?
Well, actually, I mean, it's interesting because the notion of the victim is actually relatively contemporary. I mean, I don't think that I got involved in politics because I thought I was hard done by. I mean, that in a way is the first thing that you might think, but then you actually transcend that to think about society or what causes it, whereas it's the other way around now. I mean, you kind of tend to focus on me. And it's partly the emergence of identity politics, which is what gives you the credibility these days to be a respected activist, is if you can list off the things about your identity, which are, if you kind of show your scars, as it were. And I find that limiting. So, because I suppose what I'm trying to say is I never thought of myself as an activist. I was unhappy with the world that I perceived. I wanted to change it. Like many of the people, I got involved in politics. I went to a Federation of Conservative Students meeting. I mean, it's the only one I ever went to, but I did go to it because, in other words, I didn't have a fixed political view. I was kind of looking round at all the different things. I went to Socialist Workers' Party meetings at the time. These were the days, it feels like hundreds of years ago, when at Warwick University, every week, there was, excuse me, 1,000 people at a general meeting. I used to go to these meetings, hear all these arguments, and I had no clue even whether I was left or right. But I did see that people were passionate about politics. Thank you. Theresa May, I feel for you.
What's interesting about that is it seems like, in a way, you're describing positive and negative activism as not having so much to do with the content of the politics as with the attitude. So if the attitude is more about wanting to change things externally rather than wallowing in victimhood, that seems like that makes it preferable to activism, which is about kind of saying, poor me, poor me. But in a way, the political things that are being advocated are less important than the attitude. Would you agree with that? Is it the attitude mostly that matters?
Of course, the content is all that matters. I mean, just because I was looking around, I mean, ultimately, you have to believe that the ideas that you're arguing for are far more important than being an activist. I mean, if anything, it's that kind of contentless activism that drives me mad now. I think it's more about trying to understand the world with a view to changing it, not an original thought, obviously. And the thing that the thing that I was trying to say about the victimhood thing was, I just don't think it was that you saw it about yourself being a victim. You saw, say fighting racism. You got involved in fighting racism because you saw that some people were treated differently, unequally and unfairly because of the colour of their skin. At the most superficial level, that was it. Why would that happen? And so I read about the history of immigration controls, of all of the different things that had led for that to happen historically. And I became, one of the first things I got involved in was anti-racist politics. But at no time in that sort of debate did people actually really focus on the colour of people's skin, apart from the racists, right? I mean, the whole point was that you were transcending people's ethnic backgrounds, organising fights against, racist attacks or immigration or deportations or whatever it was. And the people that you were working with, even people who were facing deportation, didn't ever suggest to themselves as victims. And you were part of a struggle that was about fighting for equality. Now, and some people might even find this, I was told at an event I spoke at recently that when I said that I effectively wanted to be colourblind and that I was more interested in the character than of someone quoting Martin Luther King than their skin colour, somebody said to me, that is just absolutely atrocious because you're missing the particular suffering of people from ethnic minorities. Who are you to say that that's just an example of white privilege? And indeed, to say that you're colourblind in most campuses in America will get you accused of racism. So that, in a way, makes a real difference. And then you're told that you haven't got an equal view on it because you are not the victim of the oppression. Whereas the way I would view the views in the past was who had the best view on it, not who had the different skin colour and therefore the legitimacy to say, that wouldn't... What difference does it matter what your skin colour is if your opinion's idiotic or weak? You want to be able to judge people on what they're saying, what they're arguing.
That's interesting. So it seems like one of the things that you've picked up on is there's been a change in anti-racism activism from 20th century activism, which was about treating people as individuals, to 21st century activism, which is about redistributing power from white society to ethnic minorities in a way where, in order for that redistribution to happen, you have to treat people as representatives of their race rather than as individuals. And if you do that, then obviously you can't look at each individual speaker and evaluate them on the merits of their argument. You have to look at them in terms of a power structure. So I was curious, what do you dislike about that way of doing anti-racism activism? What do you take issue with about this sort of power politics that's so popular today?
Well, it's not anti-racism, it's identity politics in general, I suppose. If you think about one of the things that when I wrote the book, I find that offensive. I made the point that, when people say I find that offensive, it means shut up. I mean, they're not just telling you they find it offensive. I mean, they say, I find that offensive. It's like, don't you dare say it. But if you say, as a woman, I find that offensive, or as a Muslim, I find that offensive, or as a gay man, I find that offensive, or whatever, that has a kind of double punch, right? Then you're really in trouble, right? When somebody say, as a woman, I find that offensive. Anyway, point is, what does that even mean, as a woman, I find that offensive? And when people say, surely as a woman you find that offensive, or whatever, it's like that would indicate that I and every other woman share the same views, which is not true. We're not some blob, some indivisible kind of group who all have the same outlook. And, to kind of turn it on its head, if a Muslim happens to join ISIS, well, not happens, if a Muslim joins ISIS and blows something up, we are all perfectly reasonably not going to go around saying all Muslims are ISIS supporters, right? That is a reasonable thing to say. But if you say, as a Muslim, I find that offensive, it's the same effect, right? Which is to say, well, as a Muslim, all Muslims think this is offensive. That's not true. So one of the weird things that it does is it actually completely undermines individualism, or your individual capacity to be a person, as you say. But it also, ironically, puts some people into a position of power based on the fact that they sort of act as though they're spokespersons for that particular group.
Right.
So, and that then becomes very dangerous, because actually you get a real hierarchy existing and a real competitive sort of sense of who's got the right to speak, who's more authoritative, not, again, based on what they're saying, but on their position, allegedly, as representative of some group.
Interesting. So it sounds like what you want to emphasize, at least in the present, is the fact that everybody is an individual. If you look at any group of people, whether it's people of color, women, Muslims, transgender people, not everybody in that population, whatever it is going to have the same politics. And they're not going to have the same experience. What would you say to somebody who says that so much of the progress that we've had on race and gender is because we've listened to a group of activists who seem to be speaking on behalf of all women or all people of color and saying, we have this really terrible experience that you, the mainstream, are ignoring, and we want to bring it into the public consciousness, and that's partly why things are so much better today?
Well, there's obviously some truth in that, because historically, all of the fights for oppression, I mean, I am not suggesting that there aren't specific oppressions, by the way. So it's undoubtedly the case that women suffered women's oppression, whereas non-women didn't. I mean, you know, if women were denied equality for being women, then if you're not a woman, then you don't know what, you don't experience that. You can't say that you've experienced it. But it's also true that those fighters for women's liberation, historically, who drew attention to that, you know, most women at that time actually weren't involved in politics. So they were often a minority, and they were drawing attention to an objective reality. Right. They weren't doing it as they weren't saying we as women. They might have been the people who were saying it. They weren't always the people who were saying it. Some of the great theorists on fighting oppression were not necessarily victims of that oppression. Right. And so, you know, I was very influenced, again, when I was young, by some white South Africans who'd been, I mean, just because they happened to be living in Coventry, I mean, rather than, who had been kicked out of South Africa. They were political exiles, basically, because they were supporters of the ANC, they'd had to flee and all the rest of it, and so on and so forth. But they were white South Africans. They weren't victims of apartheid, but they were political activists who had got involved in fighting apartheid in South Africa, and as a consequence, either being sent to jail and escaped and all the rest of it. So the point was, they helped me understand South Africa, and the fact that they were from South Africa gave a certain, you know, they were able to describe some place I'd never been to and explain what the situation was like. But again, they would then point me to read a book. I mean, I don't want to overdo it on the book question, but I do think this is what the life of the mind and politics is all about. I mean, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Hundreds, thousands of years of people thinking about how to struggle, and these days people treat that as though it's some kind of elitist enterprise in an ivory tower, whereas actually it was the bread and butter of all radical politics historically.
Interesting. So that leads to an issue that you've been writing about in the book and outside the book, which is the activism today around decolonializing the curriculum, which is an attempt to try and, I suppose, take the set of great works that we're expected to study, see the fact that most of those works are written by white men in positions of power, and try and diversify that curriculum by getting in voices of color, female voices, trans voices, non-Christian voices, et cetera, et cetera. What is it about that project in particular that you think is wrong-headed?
Well, I think it's done in such bad faith. I mean, literature, which is my sort of subject, just to use that one, you know, there is a canon of great literature, but it is not stuck in aspic, right? And you cannot say, you know, these are the great books and there's no other great books. And there should always be attempts at shaking that up a bit and to say, well, actually, there's what about this novel, or what about this writer, or what about this poet that you haven't heard of? But when you're then arguing over who should be in the canon of great literature, you are arguing on the basis of the fact that they are great writers. I mean, it's the literature that's driving you, and you want to shake it up and broaden out and so on and so forth. The problem with what's happening at the moment is the demand in relation to decolonizing the curriculum. It's not even argued that the people who should be studied because they're great philosophers. It's argued they should be studied because they're black or because
Right.
they're from a different ethnic minority, say, to use that as the example. And then the argument is that actually the whole of philosophy itself, those great thinkers, you know, the idea that you could kind of read Kant and think he's white and an example of a white male supremacist writer, instead of thinking he's bloody hard and what's he trying to get at, and the great and brilliant humane insights that he brought to things, or J.S. Mill or whatever, and to sort of say, yes, but, you know, those people, what did they do about slavery? In some instances, you know, they didn't fight slavery, and to kind of deconstruct them, rather than, again, reading what they wrote, the greatest contributions to liberation movements, ironically, even if they didn't intend that to be what happened. So my problem with decolonizing the curriculum is that it's adopting an identity politics approach to ideas. It doesn't develop our understanding more. The idea that, you know, some people will say, oh, you're opposed to decolonizing the curriculum because you don't think anyone should read a black philosopher is nonsense. But I am definitely not prepared. I mean, there was a big campaign amongst A-level students last year about the A-level music curriculum, about there not being enough women composers on it. And it was led by 17-year-olds. And, you know, it's great excitement, step forward for women, because the exam board changed their curriculum decision, and now Kate Bush is on the curriculum. Oh, joy. And the thing about it was, and there was this kind of like, and the thing was, they were scratching, not just Kate Bush, but she ended up there. They were scratching around for great women composers. And the reason why there are not huge numbers of great women composers in the kind of historic mix of what they were studying for their A-level was because of oppression. I understand that, right? Mm-hmm. Women were not necessarily in a position, historically, to emerge as those, you know, they didn't have the opportunities, right? And that was obviously true about people from the colonies. That's obviously the case. You can't compensate for those oppressions by some condescending thing like, oh, we'll have a black composer or a woman composer and then tick the box and then all is well. That doesn't do anything. And what's more is it dumbs down the music curriculum, the literature curriculum.
Okay, so what would you say to somebody who might object to that by saying, look, you're right that, you know, Shakespeare has had an incredible influence on literature. You're right that Beethoven has had an incredible influence on music. You're right about the influence of J.S. Mill on our ideas of liberty. But we can't trust that influence because that influence happened through the lens of racism, colonialism, sexism, and all the other backward things that we're trying to get rid of in society. So we can't, in effect, take for granted that the influence of figures from the past is worth it, because the way that those figures became influential was by becoming famous in a society that was corrupt and, in a sense, evil. How would you respond to that?
You take them at what they've written, I mean, or you listen to their music. I mean, people, you know, Wagner was a fascist, right? He was an anti-Semite and a fascist. I wouldn't have him round to dinner, and I wouldn't agree with anything he said. But he has written some of the most sublime music ever written. Now we can argue, not everybody likes Wagner, by the way, I get that. But that would be a row about music, not about his politics. That's my point I'm making, right? So I mean, it's undoubtedly the case that the ideas of previous periods I wouldn't agree with. I mean, there's quite, I mean, actually the Me Too movement at the moment is in danger of destroying a whole range of great filmmakers and so on, in terms of their films. I mean, you know, in terms of what they've done versus their films. I'm not interested in those individuals or whether they are, it's the way that you approach art. And in that instance, it's the art that speaks and transcends. I mean, most of the great classical musicians wrote music that was about, was in praise of, was Christian music, what I'm trying to say. And they were writing soaring masses, you know, like, and so on, which were meant to be about God. But I actually listen to those and I don't think of God. I think of the great music that human beings can create, and I transcend where I am and so on based on that. So it doesn't matter whether they thought that they were writing their music so that I would pray in the future. I mean, they didn't know who I was, but you know what I mean. That, you know, they thought that we'd all be listening in that way. They created an art that they lost control of, a great work of art is you put it out there, and the reader, the writer, the listener, the whatever, makes it of it as they will, and it stands on its, or falls on its own merit. So quite straightforwardly, I'm not interested. And even with philosophy, you know, because some of the arguments are, I mean, there's a campaign in, I mean, talk about the corruption of politics. There's a campaign for decolonizing the curriculum in South Africa, where it's actually very prominent now. I mean, it's a real sort of bastardization of the fight for equality that's gone on there, in my opinion, a degradation, in fact, which is that science is white supremacist and needs to be decolonized. And what they'll say is, how can you say that the scientific method is anything other than corrupted, or even objectivity? Objectivity is a white male construct. Scientific method is a white male construct. How dare you privilege that over local folklore, and so on. So there's a horribly depressing but still real film of a meeting in a university in South Africa, where the science faculty is being held to account by what kind of like this kind of scary committee of students who are basically saying, we're going to drag you off your pedestal with your white male scientific method, and how dare you tell us that that quantum physics is superior to what a woman in a village knows about the growing of nettles. I mean, that is like the level of it is. And when one of the scientists kind of almost like slightly laughs, they absolutely turn on him. Anyway, it's a film on YouTube, you know, all that. Anyway, but it's frightening, because that's kind of where you end up. I think that you have to be able to, judgment is hugely important, and I think that you need to be able to make judgment based on criteria of, you know, is this science evidence-based, does it work, say, and literature, is it brilliant writing or not, so on.
Okay. One of the other issues that you write a lot about in I Find That Offensive is the practice of no platforming at universities. And this is a practice that, to a large extent, became very much a public media issue after Germaine Greer was protested off of a campus that she was going to speak at for saying that she didn't think that transgender women were real women, although she didn't say there was anything wrong with being transgender or that she was into misgendering. So what I wanted to ask you was, what do you say to people who say, okay, no platforming is just the consequences of saying a view that a university doesn't want to associate with because it has a set of values that are at odds with the view?
Well, I mean, so the number of things to untangle. No platforming started off as a very limited tool, usually to not give platform to fascists. But actually, I've never supported no platform, because I've always felt, in fact, I've always felt and got involved, that's another thing I got involved in at university, where there were actually some real fascists, that I thought I'd rather hear them and expose their views than using the power of silencing. I think censorship is very dangerous. But now, the no platform rules have been expanded so vastly that basically it can be whatever subjectively people say is offensive. And you can ask the question, perfectly reasonable, well, you know, this is a student union, it's got its own values, it can decide. But the difficulty you've got is that what people decide you should or shouldn't hear should only ever be decided by you. And to a certain extent, I don't want anyone else to ever decide on my behalf what I should hear or what I shouldn't hear. That way, I can hear a vast variety. That's how one's opinions are forged. But this is also moved on a bit, because it used to be that we don't agree with those values, but it's posited very differently now, because it's not that people say we shouldn't have Germaine Greer here because she's transphobic. And by the way, the whole trans issue is becoming a complete nightmare in terms of policing, literally policing and silencing and smearing, and is in the process at the moment of destroying the Labour Party, in my opinion. But anyway, that to one side. It's not because they were even saying we don't approve of her values. What they said was, if she's allowed to speak, and or any other number of people, it will be harmful to the well-being of trans students. So it's become dressed up in this kind of like protecting people who will be harmed by words. And the presumption, which is why you've had the growth of safe space movements, which is that we should be able to be safe from ideas that we find offensive. And it inevitably posits the listeners of all ideas as vulnerable and that their well-being is at risk of ideas and words. And once you say that that is the way that we should behave at university, then it's the end of the university. Because obviously the whole point of a university is to shake up every orthodoxy you've ever had, to take you into a realm of ideas you've never thought of, and to make you feel incredibly uncomfortable, and to it has to be an unsafe space, not a safe space. Otherwise it empties it out of any meaning or any possibility, in fact, of education.
Now that's interesting. What I wanted to ask you is, do you think that there are any views that could potentially harm students just by hearing them?
No.
Okay. Well, let's explore that a bit, because it seems like universities at the moment often speak as though they have something like a duty of care to students, where they want to make sure that the university is an inclusive place. So, for instance, if I was a university student today as a Mexican-American, they would say that I should not have to expect as part of my educational experience being discriminated against, seeing things that are disrespectful to me on the basis of my race, insults that are racially loaded, and so on. That part of having a good education is being able to have an environment where everybody, no matter what demographic they come from, doesn't have to hear things that are sort of disrespectful and demeaning because of the demographic they come from. So is your conception of free speech incompatible with that?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different things. Starting from where you started, the notion of the university having a duty of care is, again, a relatively recent one. Although, in fact, it's not that recent, because, in fact, hard to tell, but this is true. In the 1960s, way into the 1960s, universities behaved as though they were in loco parentis. And the way that they enacted that in loco parentis, particularly in relation to female students who were obviously in a minority in those days, are just beginning to emerge as kind of equal numbers at university. Well, no, I mean, but just going to university, was as that in America, for example, in the 1960s, hard to believe this, female students had to have chaperones when they crossed campus, and there was a curfew for them. And this was done to protect them. And Camille Paglia, one of my heroines, American kind of feminist, anti-feminist, makes the point that, because she was around then in that fight, that the women's movement at that time were fighting for the right to risk being raped. If you think about it, it's an extraordinary thing to argue. But what they said was, we don't mind that we might be raped as we walk across campus on our own after a night out. Stop chaperoning us everywhere. You're not our parents. It's an infantilizing thing. Something awful might happen, but we don't want protection. We're grown-ups. This is a university. Anyway, they won that fight. Great step forward. And get to what's happened now. People say, we want to be chaperoned everywhere. We want, safe spaces. Oh my God, we might be attacked around every corner. Everything's fearful, right? So, and in loco parentis and duty of care has come back much more, come in. So it's like infantilizing. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I know that this is a sort of like terrible idea that if you didn't have duty of care by university authorities, everybody might go around, being racist to each other. I mean, it's a prejudice about people's prejudices, if you see what I mean. People will often say to us about the Battle of Ideas Festival that we have, where there's like open debate. Anyone can come. People say, you mean anyone can come? And I go, yeah. And they go, anyone can buy a ticket. You've got like 400 speakers, and anyone come in the bar and say anything. And I say, yeah. And they go, oh my God. And they sort of imagine it's like the Wild West, and that people are going to come in and go, basically go around being racist, you know what I mean? But guess what? People generally are interested in public debate. They don't go around accusing, that's one thing. Secondly, on the Mexicans, just a quick final on this bit, on the Mexicans question, I think it's like funny because one of the big sort of things that revealed what was going on campus a few years ago, when people started to be conscious of the fact that a certain amount of madness that was going on was in the cultural appropriation rows that took place at the University of East Anglia and a couple of other universities, where they banned Mexican theme nights on the basis that it was an example of cultural appropriation and insulting to Mexican students or students from Mexican background, and this was a terrible thing to do. You couldn't wear sombreros or drink tequila and all this, right? But the hilarious bit about the University of East Anglia one was that the Mexican-themed tequila party was put on by the local Mexican restaurant run by Mexicans, right? And there were no Mexican students at the university. But this was passed by the universities, like, with his protecting Mexico. I mean, it's just, do me a favour, right? So I do not think. And that's one of the things where you were saying people should go and expect to not have to, because what happens is that they'll say, we're only bringing in these censorious, overprotective regulatory rules to protect those minorities who need special protection. And it's always like the poor Mexicans, or the poor women, or the poor trans folk, or the poor lesbians. And therefore it immediately poses you as vulnerable. Again, the victim stuff is, we will look after you, we will protect you. And as a woman, I can say this, my big dread is that sort of notion of being a female, where, you know, you're not allowed into the kind of, you know, 19th century, you're not allowed into the drawing room where the men talk, smoke cigars, drink whiskey and talk politics. You kind of have to stay in the refined space because you can't be allowed to hear. You know, novels were not to be read by women, were to be protected as the weaker sex. The idea that contemporary feminism posits itself in that role, kind of courses itself into its safe space and kind of has a fainting fit every time apparently Germaine Greer is going to say something that upsets it, just is a horrifying step back.
So what would you say to your opponent who says that the reason why we need that protection is because without it, we can't have an atmosphere of equality? For an instance, if a woman goes to university and is in a gender class where she's reading a book where women are described as subhuman, where rape is described as acceptable, and lots of students in the class are going, that's interesting, then outside of the class, there's not going to be an environment where women are treated as equals. What do you think of that worry?
Well, because it makes out that everybody in that class is an idiot, and that there's no critical faculties going on. Some people might read, I mean, at the moment, so in American universities is where it's happening most, extreme examples, but it's not, it's common in American universities and it's becoming more common here. But there's been disputes in a number of universities, particularly in Columbia, where actually somebody's been sacked for this, for teaching Ovid's Metamorphoses on the basis of exactly that argument, right? That the lecturer did not give a trigger warning when teaching Ovid's Metamorphoses, and in Ovid's Metamorphoses there are examples of rape and sexual assault. And that this meant that the student concerned who complained said that this would mean that all the other students in the class would then see women in an inferior position, and that then this would lead to an atmosphere of rape culture where sexual violence was acceptable. This is Ovid's Metamorphoses, by the way, in an English literature class in Columbia University. I mean, you could cry, but that's what the argument was. It's also the case that these days, and you cannot teach the law of rape and sexual assault on most law courses in American universities because lecturers won't teach it because there's so many complaints that it's offensive. So, as an aside, how the hell are you going to prosecute a rapist if you've got nobody who's ever done the rape law, right? I mean, it's utterly ridiculous outcome. But Oxford University students last year, a couple of years ago, on criminal law course, demanded trigger warnings on their criminal law course because they said that they needed to know in advance if there was going to be anything unpleasant in what they were taught so that they could avoid the class. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're doing criminal law, I mean, Oxford, the broad view is you only have to watch Law and Order Special Victims Unit to work out that the odd bit of robbery, rape and unpleasantness is likely to occur, right? So they've either had very bad, I mean, you wouldn't want to be defended by them, would you, in a court, as an aside? But anyway, so and we laugh, right, and you think this is a joke, it's utterly mad. This was a serious campaign at Oxford University in the law department. So when I sort of raised this with some of the Oxford University law department people, they said, well, all right, that was a bit extreme. But what about those people who would hear about these things and feel very uncomfortable, and then it would create an atmosphere where they wouldn't be treated equally? And I just think this is kind of like Alice through the looking glass stuff. But the other thing is that people are not treated unequally. Inequality in society is not created by ideas in the way that you discuss them. It's only, that's not what happens. You know, you can discuss inequality without it being the same thing. If you can't tell the difference between discussing the law around sexual assault and discussing examples of sexual assault in a law class from sexual assault, we're in trouble. But the conflation of words, language and ideas with the action, the thing that has happened, is, I think, very dangerous. And you can see the way, in the hands of the state, by the way, that they can say, we are going to arrest people and put them in jail for looking at certain types of videos, tweeting certain things, which is what is happening at the moment, by the way, because that's the same as beating somebody up.
Right. So what would you say to your opponents on this issue who say, there's an entire medical industry body of experts who do empirical research on this, who think that they can show conclusively that words and ideas do have physiological effects on people, particularly disadvantaged groups, and that the university should accommodate this and provide safety for these students because these findings are empirical. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, that empirical evidence is, I don't think it exists, and I've looked at a lot of it. I mean, it's highly subjective for a start. I mean, it's not physiological. What people will say is that it's bad and detrimental to the mental health of a range of students. And I think that increasingly that's beginning to be true. Because what my book was actually about schools, not universities. It was trying to work out why at 18 you demand a safe space. And so I was tracing it back to how we socialised and reared young people, as it goes. But the reason I say that is because I think that there is a really serious issue that generationally young people are ill-equipped to deal with uncomfortable ideas, and that actually therefore they find ideas disturbing to their well-being, right? So I think that if you're reared in an atmosphere where you're told that if you're bullied at school, it will have a detrimental, devastating impact on your life that will lead to long-term mental health problems, unemployment, drug abuse, and all sorts of things, which is what the anti-bullying literature says. And then they tell you that bullying can include everything from having your head kicked in, to being called four eyes, to being called horrible names, to exclusion from friendship group. It means that young kids are being told that if they experience some of the unpleasantnesses of the casual cruelty of being 11, of which there are many examples, that it's going to have a devastating impact on their life. They actually get to a point where they can't cope, right? They're kind of scared and kind of like off and can't cope with things, right? And that is a constant drip, 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 drip. So I actually do think that we have a loss of resilience amongst a generation. That doesn't mean everybody in that generation, but that's broadly speaking true. So NUS last year did a survey. 80% of students in this country that were surveyed, fair enough, said that they'd suffered a mental health episode the year before. 80%, right? The mental health services on campuses are absolutely falling apart because they're under such strain. There's huge problems of counselling and so on. Now, I don't think that people are making it up, but I think that people pathologising, for example, exam stress or breaking up with your partner or hearing Germaine Greer or me or someone speak and thinking that this is going to kind of damage their mental health is really sad for them, and actually is not true, but it can be if you over-internalise this stuff. And then if you're indulged in it. And I sort of think about like little children. Like when I was a kid, I don't know why, you know, I was really frightened that the dressing gown that was hanging on the back of the door was a monster. I had this sort of thing. as you did, you know, I was only about 3 or something, but anyway. And, you know, my parents would come in and say, it's not a monster. Right, address it, turn the light on, it's not a monster. And my analogy is that these days you sort of go, I think there's a monster. And then your parents say, oh my God, maybe it's a monster. Look under the bed. Is there another monster? Oh my God, can we wrap you up in cotton wool and all the rest of it? And if you're reared in this constant kind of scaremongering atmosphere, which I think we are in a range of ways, I think you do get to the point where you're scared of your own shadow by the time you get to university. You run to your safe space, broadly speaking. But I also started off my professional life as a mental health social worker, so I feel passionately that the relativizing of mental health issues is really problematic. I mean, depression, you know, schizophrenia, these things are serious, horrible challenges that happen to a minority of people. And for 80% of students to think that they're suffering mental health problems means that they don't really have a sense of what the depth of mental health problems are. I mean, it's a horrible thing, and you shouldn't want it or use the label casually. And actually, those people who need that help at university, who are suffering mental health problems, are now competing with people who say, I can't cope because of the stress of exams or because I've heard a transphobic speaker.
Interesting. So what would you say to your critics who say, if what you've just said is true, if it's bad to pathologize ordinary emotions, if we go down your route, we would actually try to depathologize really extreme behaviors, and we would be telling kids, look, if you're raped or if you've been beaten up or assaulted by your parents, just get over it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's broadly what a lot of my critics say. You know, it's one of the reviews of the book said Claire Fox is the kind of person who, when some kid is kind of cutting themselves, says, oh, you know, it'll be character forming. You know, and that sort of thing. You know, the pro-bullying Claire Fox, and, you know, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and so on. And I can see that that's where you could say that I'm an insensitive, hard-nosed cow, and that I'm like arguing for some sort of like military order and, you know, all the rest of it, kind of like boot camp, like rearing of children. But I'm just not saying that. That's all. I'm calling for a sense of proportion, and also I think that, you know, I think that it worries me that so many young women in particular seem to be so fearful that they think that there's kind of rapists around every corner, like I'm worried about children being told there's paedophiles around every corner. And I think that if you also get into a situation whereby, and I've mentioned the Me Too movement, but to say it again, I mean, I think that where you have, you know, the extraordinary conflation of the most extreme and brutal forms of sexual assault, as in Harvey Weinstein, right, and the knee touching on the other extreme, to use the caricature, but nonetheless, and everything in between. And you say that all this is an example of predatory male sexual behaviour, which is always a threat to all women. What you do is you end up with a kind of puritanical anti-sex scaremongering that says to young women that they're under threat all the time from men, which is the kind of way that, you know, from an Irish Catholic background, with a perversion of that kind of argument, which is, don't trust any men, they're only out to, you know, rape you, and you know, that was kind of like, and you kind of, you know, I thought we were getting throwing the shackles of that off, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that you go, I think rape's okay. I mean, of course it doesn't mean that. Of course it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that I think that, you know, when I say we shouldn't go along with a paedophile panic that has led to a really horrible, distrustful atmosphere where no adult can kind of hug a child without people being suspicious that they're doing something untoward, where people have criminal records checks in order to just be a volunteer, you know, in the kind of, you know, to teach the kids football after school and all that sort of stuff, where the intergenerational relations have been completely perverted in a way by that mistrustful atmosphere. That is not the same as saying, oh, paedophilia, that's all right, man, you know, rape the child. I mean, that's not what I'm saying, right? And I think that actually that gets to, I think, what Lizzie said in her introduction, which is, you know, there's more straw men around in politics today than ever before. I mean, you are constantly fighting this sort of thing, which is, oh, if you're not for it, you're against it. You know what I mean? All that kind of thing. You know, so you don't believe that, so you must believe that. And I think that you know, that itself creates a kind of walking on eggshells atmosphere of not being able to speak freely, because you're constantly worried that people might call you out. You know, call you out is that whole thing. You know, I'm calling you out as a racist, I'm calling you out as a transphobe, I'm calling you out. And half the time you don't even know what it is you said, some language dispute that you've wandered into by saying the wrong thing. So you know what I'm saying.
Okay, so what would you say to somebody who would describe the things that you're giving really compelling explanations of about, you know, sensitivity and being thin-skinned and so on, and say, what if somebody said, okay, if we look at any kind of positive change in the past, whether it's gay rights, whether it's women's rights, whether it's union rights, whether it's, you know, protections for people who are working in unsafe conditions, that happens because over time society gets more prosperous. As society gets more prosperous, people get sensitive about smaller things and start making more demands. So what would you say to somebody who says, you know, the extra sensitivity is just the inevitable progress of Western civilization and the expansion of rights?
No, I've heard this argument. I mean, what's the kind of phrases, you know, first world problems, you know.
Yeah.
We've solved the big problems, we've only got the kind of small things to argue over. Well, I don't think we've solved the big problems myself. That's my view. I'm glad to live in 21st century prosperity, and I think it's broadly been a story of progress from the times when people were dying in their 40s. But there's no doubt about it, there's some very serious challenges. And those challenges are both, you know, new challenges like the real challenge of people living into their 80s and 90s, a fantastic and miraculous step forward for humanity to be in a situation where people can now live that long and often live well for that long. But we all know, without me going on, that it's a bit of a palaver now, because you've got people who for maybe 20 years might have dementia, and we don't know how to handle people who have dementia. We also don't know how to handle the fact that there's some people who live into their 90s. Many of them haven't got dementia, but, you know, what do you do with them? Everybody treats everybody like they've got it, and so on and so forth. Right? That's quite a big one, right? Never mind not having solved a load and load of other problems, and the economy is, you know, sluggish, productivity low, prosperous we might be, but we haven't exactly, you know, getting from London to Leicester in the snow. We could do with a bit of technological innovation on that front, never mind anything else. So you've got like lots of problems, that's one thing. But the other thing is that politics is not kind of like that thing where you move forward. So my argument is that I think that we live in anti-humanist times. I think that we have, I think the emergence of, you know, the fact that people actually will think of human beings as akin to animals, for example, at the moment, a kind of a real misanthropic view of humanity on the one hand. I also think that we have lost intellectual commitment to freedom. And, you know, I to say something controversial or not, I voted for and supported Brexit. And in the rows about Brexit that I subsequently never endlessly, you know, or endlessly have to have, loads of my friends voted Remain. You know, and we don't, it's not like World War III, but as you know, it's a bitter tangle on the Brexit front. But in the more acrimonious tangles with some of the main kind of exponents of Remain at the moment, and I argue for sovereignty, and people go, sovereignty, what is sovereignty? You think, God, you know, sovereignty was one of those great philosophical ideas, the sense of autonomy, of self-determination. It's not just a word. It's like hundreds of years of people fighting for freedom and their own independence and to determine their futures, as opposed to feudalism, when you were kind of like owned and determined and fixed, and you know, you were fated to be, and so on and so forth. This was about overcoming the limitations of biology, of fate, of the gods, to determine and so on and so forth. So the idea that people would kind of go, well, you use sovereignty, you know, a term created by white men, and therefore exactly, oh God, and I think that you can lose the gains. That's what I'd say. So I don't think that people are kind of just like say first world problems, got nothing better to do, but I do think that people have lost a sense of what being a political agent is, of having agency. And I think that in that sense, one of the things that victim politics and identity politics done is robbed people of a sense of acting upon the world to improve it, rather than wallowing into themselves in a kind of narcissistic way and kind of their world getting narrower.
What would you say to somebody who says you're being a bit thin-skinned about this issue? That the kind of more resilient way to think is to think, okay, if I'm a labor activist and I say something that labor doesn't agree with and they sack me, that just means I should join a different political party and labor isn't for me.
Well, that might be true. I don't care, because, you know, a witch hunt in the Labour Party against certain people, if I'm not in the Labour Party, doesn't, you know, I'm not in any of the mainstream political parties, so you could say that doesn't matter, or, you know, why don't you just go and form another party? I'm observing a silencing of people. That's what I'm objecting to. You know, it isn't strokes, because actually, you know, you're not going to go anywhere else and do it, right? Because what I'm saying is that society and political life, and now the life of the mind, universities, are becoming inhospitable to anything other than one orthodox narrative. And if you don't go along with it, you're in a lot of trouble. And the reason we started to, well, we organised this thing, Living Freedom, was because I found that more and more times when I went and spoke at universities, I get invited to speak a lot of universities, and, you know, sometimes people are trying to close me down, and, you know, just, it's not always, it doesn't always go my way. But a lot of students were saying, and a lot of people were saying, you know, we actually just don't know what to do. I mean, we just don't know what to think. We don't know how to react to this. And so we thought, well, we kind of introduce some of the philosophy and the ideas behind these things. Because you can say, well, you know, don't be thin-skinned about it. Somebody calls you a transphobe, just wander off. I mean, people are losing their jobs, their reputation. If you get called a racist, rape apologist, if you get called, I mean, you might have no sympathy whatsoever for Toby Young. I can understand that. But when they went for him, they bloody well went for him, right? I mean, he was destroyed. And what for? Tweets and articles. And when they said that he said this about it, I mean, all I can tell you is that the pictures of women's body parts, which were, you know, naff to say the least, and sexist and ridiculous, right, deserve to be, like, humiliated by. But I still don't think that means necessarily that you are a would-be rapist and sexual predator, right? And secondly, they actually said that he was arguing for the, you know, killing off of disabled people, all these kind of terrible things. And actually, if you'd have taken the time to read the articles, actually, they were actually very interesting critiques on contemporary educational policy. And he didn't say any of that. So he might be an extreme. You might think, well, I would never be like Toby Young. Let me tell you, there are people losing their jobs, their livelihoods, and their reputations because they're being called out in a kind of feeding frenzy at the present time. And so I don't think that that means that you're thin-skinned if you're worried that somebody might call you a racist, right? I think it's a legitimate thing. And by the way, I'm not a racist. And I object to the fact that over the last few days on Brexit, it has carried on, where people have actually said that I am covering up a xenophobic, racist backlash, and that actually my Brexit vote, this is from quite substantially, by the way, influential people, was just simply because I really just don't like immigrants. And you know what, I know it's on social media, but you really want to scream because you're so mad at the injustice of it. And, you know, why should we put up with all that kind of nonsense labelling to silence us and humiliate us? Because what? I've got a different opinion on the European Union. I mean, God, right? Imagine what it feels like if you're, and I've got some influence, imagine what it feels like, right, if you're just a woman who just got involved in politics for the first time and voted Brexit, to hear the people in the establishment describe you as a thick, stupid, low information, easily duped, racist who voted the wrong way because they didn't get, you know, blah, 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 blah. Imagine the frustration of that, right? The frustration, you want to kill someone, right? And that isn't right. And if you're a Remain voter who passionately believes in the EU, that's great, fine, that's an argument, that's politics, right? You shouldn't think of every other voter who voted differently to you as beyond contempt and talk about them in that way, and vice versa, But it just happens to have been slightly more one-sided, particularly in relation to the working class. So, yeah, I don't think it's thin-skinned to get absolutely infuriated at being called out for the wrong things. But I just don't think what we should do is no platform the person who calls us out, sulk, say we're offended, or say that we're about to have a nervous breakdown as a consequence. What we should do is organise, agitate and change the world.